Children are particularly more sensitive to GMOs for several reasons than adults. Number one is they have higher metabolic rates. They metabolize food quicker. They need more food, and their cells are changing quicker. They are growing rapidly, so they have a higher cell turnover. They have higher metabolic rates, higher respiratory rates, so they require more nutrition. They eat more. And number two is that children are more sensitive to smaller doses of toxins than adults. We don't respond to toxins the same way.
Their immune system is not prepared for it. They're not able to digest properly. They don't have the enzymes available to them. They don't have their gut bacteria completely developed yet.
The question of this bioaccumulation of toxins might be higher in their bodies. They have a smaller body mass. So for all those reasons, children are more susceptible.
I tell all of my pregnant women how to serve their children non-GMO foods.
We have them eat non-GMO food for at least 2 weeks. At least 2 weeks before trying to conceive, preferably longer. Because we know that if mom doesn't, that any gene changes that can be passed on to the baby can be passed on to future generations, and it's a new field of genetics called epigenetics, and that's what I'm worried about. That I thought in the old genetic days, we thought that genes weren't so mutable, and we now know that's not true. That they can change expression and quickly, and it's passed on.
If the mother eats the genetically engineered foods, it is going to affect the development and the growth of her child. It's one more factor to throw into the uterine fluid that is not good, and it will cause disaster in time.
There is no pediatrician that is not going to say nursing, breastfeeding over formula. Let's be clear. So we're all breastfeeding. I've never met a pediatrician who said don't breastfeed in my career. So breastfeeding, and then again breastfeeding. Now, in certain moms, they can't. So those babies will go on formula. I say organic formula only.
I think that pretty much most all soy infant formulas are made from genetically modified soy, which means that's a serious health hazard. The risk of allergic reactions is much too great to be feeding that to infants, especially at an early age.
Nearly all infant formulas use milk from cows injected with bovine growth hormone and derivatives of GM corn. And independent laboratory tests found significant amounts of genetically engineered soy in 4 popular soy-based infant formulas. Similac soy, 42%. Gerber Good Start Soy, 48%. Enfamil Pro Soybe, 49%. Walmart Soy, 66%. The U.S. government's WIC program provides free formula to over 2 million newborns, but only the genetically engineered varieties.
When I first discovered that GMO was in infant formula and infant food, I was outraged, honestly. I didn't know how that could have happened in this country, and I felt guilty as a mother for not knowing that it was in there and I was feeding something harmful to my child. But once I learned it was in there, it was cold turkey, just everything got thrown out, and we started from scratch.
They're really vulnerable, and we're giving their parents, before they're born, feeding them GMOs. And we know that things can get into the fetus, like Bt toxin and Roundup. And then we're feeding them infant formula with genetically engineered corn and soy, and the milk from cows injected with bovine growth hormone. What are we doing to our children?
We're just being told it's probably the best technology out there to feed the world, and that's not even true. So I'm not even sure why we have to have GMO. Doesn't make any sense.
Genetically engineered organisms are really a product to sell people. And unless there's a company trying to push a product like that and gain money, there's no point in it, because all of us can get along just fine without genetically engineered organisms. There's always a better way to achieve the same end that any genetically engineered organism is trying to do for you. There's a better way when we understand how nature does it. It's less expensive, it doesn't take so much work, and you're not destroying the environment at the same time.
I would say that we've had a huge lie perpetuated upon us by the multinational corporations, making us believe that the GMO is the way to feed the future. It is not. It is a bad idea because we don't know the adverse effects on health. It is not worth a slight increase in crop production or longevity on the shelf in order to sacrifice that for human health.
We really are at a period in human history where just because science can do something doesn't mean that science should do something.
We planted GMOs to Roundup Ready cotton in 2005, 2006, about 1,000 acres. Thought it was going to be an excellent way to remedy our high fuel costs, labor. That was before I started reading the bag on the cottonseed. There's all 7, 8 different warning labels. Don't touch it, don't put it in your mouth, don't do this, run to the doctor, call this number. And I'm sitting there thinking, what am I planting? What am I actually putting in the earth? I'm trying to save a little bit of fuel. I was adding to the problem. I was adding to this toxic recipe that is creating the need for more chemicals. I mean, that's the solution that we're throwing at all of our problems in agriculture, and we wonder why we have more problems.
The system has done a very, very good job of educating people into the need for GMO grains because we can't feed the world. It's just the opposite. I've just finished the season in my community where we're running trials and putting in test plots for corn. We're doing better than the GMOs, hands down.
The mythology that somehow the people of the world are starving because there's not enough food is very strong and has been drummed into us for 30 years now, 40 years. In fact, there's over 1.5 times more food on the planet than we need for every man, woman, and child. Even Josette Sheehan of the World Food Program admitted at the height of the food crisis that the problem wasn't lack of food. There's plenty of food. People couldn't afford it.
I was at a conference of some of the experts who actually know how to feed the world. And we had Secretary Vilsack there speak to us. And when he started talking about how GMOs could feed the world, he was actually booed and hissed by these experts.
The evidence does not exist to support the claim that GMOs are going to be the way forward to feed the world in a way that's sustainable and equitable in the future.
The world can feed itself. The world has always fed itself. The world has enough food. Due to corruption, people may not be getting food, but there's plenty of food. Monsanto's whole drive to create GMOs is a disaster in front of us now. The world can get rid of it. The world should get rid of it. The sooner the better, now.
There's a lot of GMO myths about what GMOs are supposed to do or can do. They're supposed to increase yields. Well, in actuality, they reduce average yield. Look at the Union of Concerned Scientists report, Failure to Yield. There have been studies done on millions of farms in developing nations showing an average increase of yield of 79% for sustainable techniques, not for GMOs. In the United States, GMOs grown side by side with organic show no difference for soy and corn, except in times of drought where the organic outperforms the GMOs. They also say that GMOs are supposed to increase farmer profit. Well, that's not true.
Essentially all of the independent studies, and by that I mean a study not paid for directly or indirectly by the biotech industry, all independent studies conclude that GM technology has been close to an economic wash.
They said GMOs would increase U.S. exports. The opposite happened. We lost 99% of our corn exports to Europe.
The biotech industry has claimed for years that herbicide-tolerant crops reduce the pounds of herbicides applied. And while that's true for the first few years after a new herbicide-tolerant crop variety is introduced, after a few years there's shifts in weeds and the beginning of resistance emerges, and we see a steady incremental rise in herbicide use.
A study found that 323 million more pounds of pesticides have been applied on genetically engineered crops compared to their non-engineered counterparts in the U.S. We've got 10,000 acres of cotton in Georgia that are now resistant to all herbicides, including glyphosate. So guess how they're controlling them? They're having to use machetes. Glyphosate's no longer working, so now they want to get crops that are engineered with 2,4-D. For those of you that are too young to know that, that was one of the components of Agent Orange, so that's not a benign herbicide.
There is so much increase in the use of Roundup. It's now found by the U.S. Geological Survey in 60 to 100% of the air samples, the rain samples, and the water samples. It's in the urine of city dwellers. It's in the blood of pregnant women. It's in their fetuses. It's everywhere.
It's a scam. This is a money-making scam for these billion-dollar corporations. It's not going to improve our quality of life. It's not going to improve anything that happens within nature.
It's not about feeding the world. It's not about the blind will see and the lame shall walk. It's about chemical companies selling chemicals.
When I heard the Monsanto master plan, I was stunned. The goal of Monsanto was to replace all natural seed, to have all global agriculture completely driven by genetically modified seed, and to create a market for the chemicals associated with those genetically modified seed. There was no sense of nature. There was discussion of how to eliminate natural seed.
When I get in discussions with people, they say, well, the government reviewed them, the government's approved them, there were mountains of studies done. They couldn't have gotten it that wrong, and if it was so bad, somebody would speak up about it. But in reality, the few people that have spoken up about it have paid a high personal and professional price for it. The attacks on people who have raised questions about this technology are very well covered. They're no secret, and they've had a very chilling effect on the willingness of other scientists to even want to carry out the work. One way to discourage scientists from working in an area is to show them that if they happen to come up with findings that don't jive with the PR message from the biotech industry, and if they were to go on and publish their results or talk about them at a professional meeting, that their dean is going to be visited by a contingent from the companies. Politicians at the state level will be visited and said, gee, you know what's going on in the agronomy department at the university? There's this professor, he's out to hurt your farmers. You better call the dean up and get that person back on message. And this happens absolutely routinely.
And quite frankly, because of the direct investments of these companies in our universities, new professors know very well that if you expect to get tenure, don't do any negative research on GMOs.
When I spoke to the United Nations about the dangers of genetically engineered organisms, and then I returned to my department at Oregon State University, I soon afterwards received a letter from a past president of Oregon State University, basically saying that if you didn't believe in the technology, if you weren't heart and soul into this industry, this technology, that you really didn't belong at Oregon State University.
It's just remarkable the degree to which a single company has been able to dominate what gets discussed, how it's discussed, and who is willing to participate in that debate.
Researchers have a hard time getting a hold of seeds in order to carry out research because Monsanto, Syngenta, and DuPont will not give the seeds away for research. They keep the seeds, they do their own research, which supports their own industrial objectives. So it's very difficult to do research, and then once it's done, it's very hard to get out there.
Many researchers that are involved in working on GMO crops are severely penalized. They've lost their jobs, they've had their funding canceled, been moved out of their laboratories.
As soon as you go up against these multinational corporations, they try to shred your reputation. They try to suggest that your methodology is inappropriate, is not right.
Ultimately, the buck stops at the scientist evaluating. That's me. Then if I agree, then I'm part of the corruption. That's happening. If I don't agree, I get fired. I chose to be fired.
Dr. Arpad Pustai, one of the leading researchers in the world in his field, was given a grant of $3 million to figure out how to test for the safety of GMOs. His research was supposed to create the protocols that would be used for approvals in the EU. He put rats through his protocols, and it turns out the process of genetic engineering was inherently unsafe and caused potentially precancerous cell growth in their digestive tracts, smaller brains, livers, and testicles, partial atrophy of the liver, damaged immune system in just 10 days. When he went public with his concerns, he was a hero for about 2 days at his prestigious institute. Then 2 phone calls were allegedly placed from the UK Prime Minister's office, forwarded through the receptionist to the director. The next morning, Dr. Pustai was fired from his job after 35 years, silenced with threats of a lawsuit. His 20-member research team was disbanded. They took away the data. They never implemented his protocols. Instead, they embarked on a campaign to destroy his reputation.
In Argentina, when the scientist Andres Carrasco was planning to give a lecture to a group about Roundup and its link to birth defects, an organized mob of about 100 attacked him. He was able to make it into his car, where he locked himself in, but they beat his car for 2 hours. His friends were not so lucky. One was knocked unconscious, the other paralyzed. Monsanto talks about feeding the world. This is their PR concoction. Let's take a look at what's happening in India. They took over the cottonseed industry and are forcing millions of farmers to plant their Bt cotton. Now, cotton is engineered to produce an insecticide which breaks open the stomach of insects and kills them. The normal natural Bt is found in soil bacteria. When that's used as a spray in the Pacific Northwest, for example, for gypsy moths, about 500 people complained of allergic and flu-like symptoms. Some had to go to the hospital. Now in India, thousands of workers are complaining of the same symptoms. Many are getting rashes, and many are itching.
Farmers have been complaining that they have itching. When they grow, they go to pluck, they have itching sensation.
ఈ బీటీలో పనిచేసే ఎవరైతే కూలీలు ఉన్నారో వాళ్ళకి ఆ పని చేసేటప్పుడు ఎలర్జీస్ రావటం మేము గమనించడం జరిగింది. అదే నాన్ బీటీలో పనిచేసే వారికి అందులో ఎలర్జీస్ అనేటివి ఏమి రాదు.
In India, they allow animals to graze on the cotton plants after harvest. They've had no problem for years. When they introduced Bt cotton, however, they noticed that thousands of animals got sick and thousands died. There's a small organization called Deccan Development Society that pleaded with the government to do tests on the Bt cotton to see if it was causing the animal deaths. They went to the government, they didn't follow through. They went to universities, they didn't do anything. So DDS did the study itself. They took 9 sheep. 6 were eating either Bolgard 1 or Bolgard 2 Bt cotton, 3 non-GMO cotton plants.
So within a month, all the animals which ate on Bolgard 1, Bolgard 2, they died. And the animals which ate on non-Bt, non-pestle managed cotton are still alive and are still active.
I visited a village in Andhra Pradesh. They had allowed their buffalo to graze on cotton plants after harvest for years without a problem. They allowed their 13 buffalo to graze on Bt cotton plants for a single day. Within 3 days, all 13 buffalo were dead. We know that the crops that are genetically engineered have unpredicted side effects. This can not only affect health, but also the agronomic properties. The Bt cotton grown in India is extremely unreliable. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But there they have no safety net. Millions of farmers have invested money in the more expensive seeds and associated chemicals.
Many have borrowed heavily at high interests. When the cotton doesn't work out, many of these farmers cannot even pay back their high interest loans. The number of farmer suicides as a result is astounding.
High-cost seed with unreliable performance is what is getting farmers into debt, and debt is what is causing the farm suicides. All our studies over the last decade show that the suicides are concentrated in the cotton areas, and in cotton, much higher suicides in the BT cotton belts. My assessment is 250,000 farm suicides in this country, of which at least 3/4 is BT linen.
A farmer in South Africa was growing genetically engineered corn and feeding it to his animals. His dairy cows were having problems with milk production, arthritic-type conditions, infertility, and short lifespans. The pigs were also affected.
The biggest single thing was reproductive failure. They'd have respiratory issues, things like pneumonia, for instance, and then they'd also get scours or diarrhea to the point, anyway, that they would succumb to death. They would be cannibalistic, and they would literally eat the tails right off each other. You know, Dr. Scow, he said, "You've told me so many things, we've discussed so many things. Can you narrow it down to just one simple thing I can go home and do?" And I says, "Yeah, very easily to do." I says, "Go home and never, ever put another GMO product on your farm."
After growing non-GMO corn and feeding it to his animals,